Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 brand's vintage sports pictorium gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
He was the American League Rookie of the Year in 1949. But injuries derailed him for a few years afterwards. Later, a bum shoulder did not deter him, and despite the fact that he could barely toss the ball more than 100 feet, his bat was just too big to keep out of the lineup. And for 9 straight years, he hit 20-plus home runs. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to take a look back at a baseball player who persevered to enjoy an absolutely terrific career, Roy Sievers.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello, and welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. And today, the story of a truly terrific baseball player, Roy Sievers. Now, while some of the forgotten stars we discuss on SFH are forgotten Hall of Famers or borderline Hall of Famers, sometimes we focus on guys who are just really great or good ball players who contribute mightily to their teams, enjoyed truly outstanding careers, but they weren't necessarily Hall of Fame careers. And I think that's where Roy Sievers fits in. But, and it's a big but, had Sievers not struggled with injuries for the 4 seasons immediately following his 1949 Rookie of the Year campaign, we might actually be talking about a guy who was Hall of Fame material. After all, Sievers broke into baseball in 1949 with the St. Louis Browns and ultimately called it quits 17 years later, 1965, with the second version of the Washington Senators. Between that, he hit 318 home runs that included a high of 42 in 1957 with the original Washington Senators. He was a 4-time All-Star and had this uncanny knack for late-inning heroics. And we'll get to that later with our guest, Greg Wolf. Greg, who is a co-director of Saber's biography project, has written dozens of biographies for Saber. That's the Society for American Baseball Research, including a terrific bio on Sievers. Oh, by the way, Greg is also a published author and editor, and his newest book, Wrigley Field, The Friendly Confines at Clark and Addison, was just released, and you can pick up a copy by visiting saber.org, that's SABR.org, or on Amazon. Remember, you can always find out more about Sports Forgotten Heroes by visiting our website, sportsfh.com, where you can quickly search for any of our past episodes, learn more about our guests, access links to more information about the forgotten stars we talk about, and send us comments or suggestions for stars you'd like to learn more about. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Look for our page on Facebook, and now you can follow us on Instagram as well. Just look for Sports Forgotten Heroes. Oh, and don't forget, keep those 5-star ratings coming, and leave a comment too. Finally, let your family and friends know about our podcast. You never know, they might like Sports Forgotten Heroes as well. Okay, now, let's get to Greg Wolf and our discussion about one of baseball's forgotten heroes, Roy Sievers. Greg, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. I'm so glad you decided to return.
Warren, it's a pleasure to talk to you again. I appreciate the invitation.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about Roy Sievers. And I guess the way we should start is, what intrigued you most about him? Why write a bio about Roy Sievers?
Well, let me give you a little bit of background information, Warren. I know I've done it before on the other talks that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
I currently serve as the co-director of the biography project, which is sponsored by the Society for American Baseball Research. And in the bio project, one of our goals is to create a biography for every Major League Baseball player. Currently, we have approaching 5,000 bios of primarily Major League players, some Negro League players. And around 5 years ago, Saber was working on a book about the 1964 Phillies, and I chose to write the bio for Roy Sievers, and it was eventually included in this book. At that time, one of the reasons I wanted to write about Roy Sievers was because he was one of the few remaining living members of the St. Louis Browns.
Mm-hmm.
It was my first interest of the players who played for the Phillies. Some had been chosen, but this is a player that I thought was very intriguing. But the more I began to research Roy Sievers, he retired well before my recollections of baseball go back. He retired after the 1965 season.
Mm-hmm.
And me, there are really 4 or 5 things that I find to be very interesting about Roy Sievers. And if I could tell you what they are.
Sure.
I think 5 things, and maybe we can really begin to deconstruct his career in baseball. Number one, I think what's interesting is his incredible perseverance. He suffered through several debilitating and career-threatening injuries very early on in his career, and it looked like his career might be over. So one is his perseverance. Number 2, he is the first American League Rookie of the Year. That was in 1949.
Yep.
Number 3, he's a remarkably clutch home run hitter. About 1/4 of his home runs were hit in the 8th inning or later. And I think number 3 is that he was known for his sweet home run stroke. He had a very, I would say, a textbook swing. And there are some other interesting factoids about Roy Sievers. He was the first Major League Baseball player to lead a league in both home runs and RBIs, playing for a last-place team.
Interesting. When we look back at the history of baseball, you would say, yeah, obviously Babe Ruth is an important part of the history of baseball. Hank Aaron, Lou Gehrig, later on Bobby or Barry Bonds. Is Roy Sievers an important part of that history, the history of baseball?
That's a good question, and I would simply say yes, he is. I think today, when we look at what baseball means, we tend to immediately focus in on home runs for hitters, for example, and those home run statistics are so skewed, especially over the last 40 and 50 years, that someone like Roy Sievers, who hit only, and I put only in parentheses, 318 home runs, is a forgotten figure. However, in the context of when he played and when he starred, he was a 5-time All-Star in the 1950s. He was, in fact, considered one of the most feared and best sluggers, not just in the American League, but in baseball in the 1950s. So in that respect, I think he is important. Number 2, when we think of home run hitters now, we might have 400 home runs as a milestone. Maybe it's even 500 home runs now as a milestone. But if we take a look at baseball in the 1950s, we have to remember that Roy Sievers was just the 18th hitter in baseball history to hit at least 300 home runs. I don't think anybody would have thought that Roy Sievers was one of the top 20 home run hitters at one time in his career.
Yeah.
I mean, he is. I think Roy Sievers is one of these players like Joe Adcock, like Bob Allison, like Veeck Wertz, that maybe history has forgotten, not because they weren't good, not at all, but because times change. They played for, at least in the case of Roy Sievers, he played primarily with very poor teams during his most productive years, and he was overlooked.
Yep. So let's go back to the beginning for Roy and what you had talked about just before, one of his big points, which was Rookie of the Year. So in 1947, baseball established a new award. It was called the Rookie of the Year Award, and it was handed out to the best rookie in all of baseball. And the first award went to, surprise, Jackie Robinson.
Right.
The second year it went to Alvin Dark. But 1949 is when baseball decided to hand out an award for the American League Rookie of the Year and the National League Rookie of the Year. And Sievers won it in 49. Was it a surprise to anyone? I mean, like many, he thought he should have been on the big league ball club a few years earlier.
Yes, in fact, Roy Sievers is really a dark horse in 1949. Maybe a few things about his background. Well, Roy Sievers, as you mentioned, in 1949 with the St. Louis Browns, he's a hometown product. So he grew up on the north side of St. Louis, just a few blocks from Sportsman's Park, located at the intersection of Grand and Dottier Avenue on the north side, a few miles north of St. Louis University. And he grew up there. That park, of course, was the home of both the Browns and the Cardinals. The Browns owned the park, as you know, and the Cardinals were, in fact, the tenants of the Browns. Roy Sievers grew up playing baseball. His father had an unsuccessful tryout as a major leaguer with the Detroit Tigers in the late teens. And Roy Sievers played. He had an interesting story about his high school. He was quite a natural athlete. He played at Beaumont High School. Beaumont High School was located. It closed just a few years ago. But an interesting thing, Beaumont High School was built on the site of the old Robeson Field. Robeson Field is where the St. Louis Cardinals played baseball until 1920. And in mid-1920, the Cardinals moved from Robeson Field over to Sportsman's Park. On the site of Robeson Field, Beaumont High School was built. North St. Louis was an incredibly densely populated area. St. Louis was one of the biggest cities in the U.S. In 1900, it was still among the top 5 biggest cities in the United States, and very densely populated on the north side. And St. Louis was, it was a really popular baseball city, a mecca, if you will, of baseball. And Roy Sievers began to attract scouts already by the time he was 16 years old, playing at Beaumont High School. His team had a number of future major leaguers, and he eventually signed in 1945, not by the Cardinals, but by the St. Louis Browns. One of the reasons that he signed with the St. Louis Browns in 1945 is because he thought that he could make it to the big league roster a little bit quicker with the St. Louis Browns. And I think this story is worth telling.
Sure.
Keep in mind, we often think of the St. Louis Browns as one of the worst teams in American League history. In fact, they were. But In 1944, during the war years, they actually won their first and only pennant in 1944 and played the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series. They lost that World Series. It was much closer than experts had predicted. The Cardinals eventually won in 4 games. It was tied 2-2, and then the Cardinals won the last 2. Of course, all 6 games were played in Sportsman's Park. And in 1945, the St. Louis Browns had another winning season, consecutive winning seasons for the first time in 20 years. Anyway, despite those wins, those consecutive winning seasons, the Cardinals were a cash-strapped team. It was owned by the DeWitt family at that time, and they did not have a very developed farm system. And the farm system, of course, for the St. Louis Cardinals, well, it was known as the chain gang. Of course, Branch Rickey begins to start that farm system in the 1920s, and it eventually grows to almost 30 minor league teams at one point. And so he signed in 45, thought his best chance to become a major leaguer would be with the St. Louis Browns. He was drafted into the Army. 2 years later, he goes to spring training in 1947. And like you said, he thought that he was major league ready in 1947. Of course, he was just around 20 years old, so and hadn't played minor league yet. But he was at the big league camp in 1947. That's a really important point. He had a good camp and was farmed out to the low minor leagues, to a Class C team, a Class C league, and wound up leading the Central Association in home runs. Went back to spring training in 1948 with the Browns, had another good spring training, but was farmed out again and spent most of the 48 season in Class B baseball. Class B, Warren. In 1949, he makes the team in 1949, makes the big league roster. Now, the Browns, well, after their 2 winning seasons, they were back to their normal situation in the second division of the American League. And for readers who might not be that aware, Major League Baseball consisted obviously of the 2 leagues, American and National League, and they both had 8 teams. And the top 4, that was called the first division, and the bottom 4 was called the second division. That was important because World Series earnings went to the top 4 teams in each league. So it was important for the teams, at least financially lucrative to the players, to be among those top 4 teams. But the Browns were back into their customary status of being a second division team.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So in 49, though, he does make the team.
He makes the team.
And he hits 306 with 16 homers, 91 ribbies. So he felt like he belonged, and he sort of proved that he belonged. How frustrated was he?
Well, I have to say that I had the pleasure of interviewing Roy Sievers a number of times for the interview, for the biography that I wrote about him. And when I interviewed him, he was in his mid-80s. He died at age 90 in 2007. So I was able to interview him on a number of occasions and talk to him about baseball in general, even more than that. It was, I think all baseball players want to be in the big leagues. And and of course he said and believed that he should have been on the team. Given how bad the Browns were, he was probably right. But, what major league manager, or at the time general manager, would promote someone who had only played less than 250 games, or about 250 games in Class B and C ball, sprinkled in a few games on the A level, so not much at all. But he have a fine season. He batted over 300. In fact, that was his career high batting average, 306. He batted over 300 again in his career, but that was his career high, 306. 16 home runs might not sound like a lot, but it was the most among rookies that year in baseball. And his 91 RBIs was ranked 6th in the American League. So a lot of RBIs for, quite honestly, an absolute terrible team.
They must have thought really highly of him to vote him Rookie of the Year, because he beat out a guy by the name of Alex Kellner, who won 20 games for the Philadelphia Athletics.
Exactly. He was touted early in the 1949 season. Once he moved into the starting role in the outfield, he was touted as the best product ever out of St. Louis, the best baseball prospect out of St. Louis. And you can imagine he was highly sought after by major league teams already after the 1949 season. Clubs had the Yankees. There were a lot of rumors that the Yankees were trying to acquire him. Even Connie Mack had, and that was another cash-strapped team, the Philadelphia Athletics. They had attempted to acquire him. So a lot of teams, major league teams, were attempting to procure Sievers already. So now it's hard to say why. I mean, I can't. I can speculate. There could be a number of reasons why he might have beat out Kellner in 1949. Well, one is the Sporting News was, of course, based in St. Louis.
And
played a role. The A's were a terrible team, but I think playing in St. Louis gave you a little bit of publicity. Even by playing for the Browns, you got some publicity. Of course, the Sporting News was such an important publication for baseball for generations, for 70, 80 years.
Sure. Hey, Greg, after that 49 season, he really struggled. In fact, it wasn't until 1954 that he would have another really good season. In 1950, he played in just 113 games, and he hit .238 with 10 homers and 57 ribbies. In 51, he played in just 31 games. In 52, he only played in 11 games. 1953, as I look through here, he played in 92 games. What happened? I read where he had a shoulder injury. How bad was it, and how did he sustain it, and how did he overcome it?
It was bad enough that, I'll start off by saying in 1950, he's being touted as, one of the next superstars.
Mm-hmm.
And 1950 was in many ways a wash because of a terrible, terrible slump. A sophomore slump. He was probably pressing, and he eventually lost his job. He lost his starting position in 1950. So you have a sophomore slump. Now, what makes this worse is in 1951, he starts off the season. He's demoted to there's an attempt for him to play third base. That fails, and he's ultimately demoted to the Texas League, to San Antonio in the Texas League. All right, and so they think that he needs some seasoning in the Texas League, and it's precisely there where he injures his shoulder in early August. He falls on his shoulder. On his Sievers threw right from the right side and batted from the right side, and he fell on his right shoulder in early August, and that really ended his season right there. This shoulder was very damaged, and it puts him on the shelf for most of the rest of the season. There's an attempt to come back, but he's suffering. In spring training with the Browns in 1952, he suffers two injuries that basically jeopardize his career. He dislocates his arm, and he has some very serious nerve damage in his shoulder, and undergoes experimental surgery in 1952. This is done, if I recall correctly, at Johns Hopkins Hospital. It was a surgery that Sievers, in the interview with me, told me that he thought he could not lift his arm, his right arm to throw.
Wow.
He could lift his arm to throw the baseball. He thought his career was over. Even after the surgery, as I said, the surgery in 1952. He thought his career might be over. He only played in 11 major league games in 1952. He could barely hit the ball. He had no power at all. He couldn't follow through at all in 1952. He came back in 1953, and Sievers mentioned two people who had a big role in his career at this point, and really looked at them as helping to save his career. And the first person is the Browns athletic trainer, whose name was Bob Bauman. Mm-hmm. In St. Louis baseball history, this is really, really an important person. Bob Bauman was also the trainer at St. Louis University in sports. And Bob Bauman really worked with him day and night. In 1953, at spring training, Sievers could still not lift his arm, much above his shoulder. Okay? So you can imagine how, from the outfield, are you going to throw the ball if you can only bring up your arm to your shoulder? Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. So he worked with him. And number two, Bill Veeck, who had purchased the Browns from the DeWitt family in 1951. He becomes the majority owner. Mm-hmm. So he's working with Sievers as well. He says, well, if you can't throw the ball from the outfield, let's work on becoming a first baseman. So he simply hit baseballs to him at first base to help him learn.
I cannot imagine Bill Veeck with a bat in his hands and hitting ground balls to Roy Sievers. Just doesn't seem. My image of Bill Veeck is not a guy like that.
Well, I know exactly what you mean. So you have, sports shirt Veeck. He, as you know, he had a foot amputated, and he often simply walked around in. Well, literally a stump, as you know.
He actually carved into his prosthetic leg an ashtray.
Yes, I was going to say he was probably on the field. Now, Bill Veeck kept an apartment in Sportsman's Park, so he would have been living there at the time. You can imagine him strolling out of his office, out of his apartment. He's out there smoking a cigarette and hitting grounders with a fungo bat to Roy Sievers, who then can't throw the balls back to him. I mean, it sounds funny, but without those personalities, Roy Sievers said that his career would never have been rejuvenated. And throughout the season, well, at least for the first half of the 1953 season, it looked like that Sievers could not come back. He was hitting under 200 through June, through the first 2 months of the season, but he got his stroke back, and for the remainder of the season, so let's say for the last 3 months of the season, did get his stroke back and batted around 300, granted with not much power at all. He still could not drive the ball, couldn't hit the ball, had no upward trajectory on the ball. But he was able to become a starter once again. Now, of course,
let me ask you this. Let me interject here. Why did Bill Veeck take such an interest in Roy Sievers?
Well, I'll say that Bill Veeck belongs in the Hall of Fame. It's senseless that he's not in the Hall of Fame.
With all he did, yeah.
And Bill Veeck's father, Bill Veeck Sr., who was the business manager for the Chicago Cubs, he should be in the Hall of Fame as well. That's just my pontification right now. Bill Veeck, I have interviewed a lot of former St. Louis Browns. Granted, there are fewer and fewer. Mm-hmm. I wrote the biography for Virgil Trucks, who played for the Browns for a short time, for Ned Garver, who played for the Browns, who won 20 games for a last-place team for the Browns in the early 50s. everyone that I spoke to who played for Bill Veeck and the Browns in those 2 years in the early 1950s, so 52 and 53, all said that Bill Veeck cared a lot about every one of his players. At the same time, Bill Veeck recognized that he had very limited money. He, of course, he had owned the Cleveland Indians, took them to the World Series in 1948, and a divorce caused him to sell that club. When he, about a year and a half later, purchases the Browns. But the players that I spoke to all said that this was a professional. He loved his players and was truly concerned about the welfare of the players. Now, that's what players have told me. And he wanted his players to succeed. Now, Bill Veeck had been trying to relocate the Browns. Immediately when he bought them, he wanted to relocate the Browns. One of the places that he had tried to move was, of course, Milwaukee. In 1952, he tried to move to Milwaukee, and he was blocked. One of the people who blocked Bill Veeck from moving to Milwaukee in 1952 was the Perini family, who owned the Boston Braves, and they moved there several weeks later, of course, in Major League Baseball accepted them. Bill Veeck was a master showman. He grated the nerves of the baseball establishment with all of his kooky marketing ploys, everything from Eddie Goodell, as you know, the 3'7" pinch hitter to start the game, to the manager of the day stories. But the players must have truly respected Bill Veeck. And eventually he has to sell the club, and he does sell the team in 1953 at the end of the 53 season, sells them to an outfit in Baltimore. And so Sievers is on his way to Baltimore.
Well, but before we get there, I know we're talking about Roy Sievers, but I'm really interested in the story of Bill Veeck a little bit as well. And one of the questions I have is why the Browns struggled so much in St. Louis, and they owned Sportsman's Park, as you said, right, and yet the Cardinals were the team that stayed. So talk a little bit more about the popularity of both the Browns and the Cardinals. Why were the Cardinals the more popular team? And when the Browns moved to Baltimore, what happened to Sportsman's Park? Was that sold as well?
The story really has to go back about 25 years. And in the early 1920s, we're talking about the late teens and the early 1920s, the St. Louis Browns were the big team in St. Louis. The St. Louis Browns and the Cardinals were the second-rate team. The Browns were, in fact, an original inaugural member of the American League. They actually started in Milwaukee, and they moved after the 1901 season to St. Louis in 1902. And they were the top team in the late teens and 20s, early 20s in St. Louis. A big change occurred. It was a cash-strapped club, but they had a lot of stars on that team. Sisler and Ken Williams, just to name two. In the early 1920s, two things happened. Number one, a very important a new ownership group took over the Cardinals, and that was Sam Braden. And Sam Braden also brings in his team. Brings in Branch Rickey, who of course also was with the St. Louis Browns. Branch Rickey was already with the St. Louis Cardinals by the time Braden purchased the club, but he begins to play a bigger and bigger role with the St. Louis Cardinals. And through the development of the farm system, Branch Rickey's idea, the accumulation of power, the accumulation of players, they develop into simply Oh well, their dynasty. The Cardinals win the pennant, 5 pennants in 9 years between 26 and 1934, and of course they have that pennant run, winning 4 more pennants in the 1940s between 42 and 46. So they have a team that is popular among the fans, and the Browns are by a number of very cash-strapped teams, cash-strapped ownership groups. The Phil Ball ownership group before DeWitt was also very cash-strapped. And the Browns, because they're poor teams, they had a very, very limited farm club. When you're losing 100 games or 95 games in a 154-game schedule, you're not drawing the fans. And we're talking about during the Great Depression in St. Louis, when both teams were hit very hard. We're talking about an average of 3,000 fans coming to the Browns games in the 1930s.
Wow.
Right. And so it's simply developed that, you have momentum, of course, with the St. Louis Cardinals, and the prolonged success that the Cardinals had between their first pennant in 1926 and 1946. These 21 years, that was simply a phenomenal run of success.
Sure.
Cardinals did not integrate as quickly, of course, as we know, as other National League teams, and so they began to have some struggles in the 1950s. They didn't integrate like the Braves did, and the Giants did, and the Dodgers did, and the Pirates did. So they didn't integrate as quickly. And the Browns, well, if you have an owner who simply is selling off his talent after 1 and 2 seasons, there's a lot of turnover for the Browns. When the Browns sell the team to the Baltimore ownership group, they sell Sportsman's Park to the St. Louis Cardinals ownership group.
Okay.
So it's transferred over.
Okay. Now, like you said, they sold the team. Veeck sold the team to the Baltimore ownership group in 1953, and Sievers was on his way to Baltimore. Well, maybe not. They traded him. They traded him to Washington. Why?
Well, number one, Baltimore didn't think that he could play the outfield. He still could not raise his arm above his shoulder. Now, we're talking about an injury now that's 2 years old. 3 years if you go back to the initial injury in 1951, right? The end of 1951. So now we're talking about almost 3 years. He still cannot lift his arm above his shoulder. The Orioles said this person, there's no way that he's going to be able to throw the ball. There's no way that he can play the outfield. He was immediately shipped to Washington.
But what I'm not understanding is why Baltimore insisted on playing Sievers in the outfield when Veeck and Bowman were trying to work him into a first baseman. Why did Baltimore not consider Roy Sievers a first baseman at that point?
Well, it wasn't a question of just having him as a first baseman. They did not think that he could ever develop into a bona fide hitter again.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just not being able to, it's not just, they looked at him as someone who might be out of baseball in 1 year. They this as, Sievers said that he wanted to stay in Baltimore, was excited about basically playing for yet another, in many ways, a new club, of course, a new club for that city. But he still could not lift his arm above his shoulder. And when he arrived in Washington, the manager was Bucky Harris. Bucky Harris is a Hall of Famer, and his history with the Senators go back to the World Series championship in 1924 when he was a player manager for the club. Bucky Harris told Sievers that he didn't even think that he should be on the team. He wasn't even sure where he would play. Now, he couldn't play first base for the Washington Senators, that was for sure. they already had one of the best first basemen, and that was Mickey Vernon. Mickey Vernon led the American League in hitting in 1953. Even though he was in his mid-30s, he batted something like 343 in 1953 and drove in 100 runs. That was their best player. So he was Bucky Harris. He didn't even think that he could. He wasn't even sure where he would play.
Mm-hmm.
He put him out in left field. Sievers told me that his surgeon warned him that he could simply rip his shoulder up if he tried to throw the ball from the outfield.
Wow.
And so he's put in the outfield. He can't lift his arm up. And he tells me that he is out there. He catches a ball in left field. Let's say if on the fly, he's having to hold his glove in an awkward way. So his elbow was almost flush to his, let's say, to his waist, catching the ball. He basically can't lunge at anything. He can't dive because of a fear of injuring his shoulder again. And if he does catch something on the bounce, he's having to relay basically a 150-yard throw or 150 feet throw to the second baseman, or to the shortstop, depending on where he is, probably to the shortstop primarily. But he's having to relay the ball in, so he can't even throw the ball.
Wow. But in the end, the trade to Washington ends up being a blessing. I mean, this is where Roy Sievers finally gets his game back, and he really took off. I mean, he wound up being one of the greats in Senators team history. And we're talking about the original Washington Senators who ultimately became the Minnesota Twins. I mean, his first year in Washington, playing at Griffith Stadium, after a slow start, bang, he figures it out. And he goes on to whack 24 home runs and knock in 102. He was off and running. So tell us a little more about his years with the Senators, and of course that one very special year, 1957, when he hit 301 with 42 home runs and 114 ribbies.
Well, Warren, I would really say that the 6 years that he spent with the Senators, 1954 to 1959, really underscore Roy Sievers' perseverance. This is someone who grew up during the Great Depression. His parents didn't have a whole lot. Roy Sievers was determined. If he had not been determined, he would have quit baseball during the 4 years during which he played 250 games in 4 years, and it looked like his career would be over. All 6 years in Washington, he hit over 20 home runs. He set new Washington Senator home run records. His first year with 24, his second year with 25, his third year with 29, and then in his fourth year, he set yet another record for the Senators with 42 home runs. He was the best home run hitter to that point in Senators history. I dare say that, I don't know, maybe his number 2 should be retired for the Senators. I don't now, of course, that's the Twins. They moved after the 1960 season.
Right.
He was an all-star. He was one of the most respected players in baseball. He was a quiet, hard worker. He was feared, yet he played in practical anonymity for a team which, like the St. Louis Browns, was among the worst in baseball and had been among the worst for a generation since their last World Series appearance when Walter Johnson was a manager in the early 1930s. He played 6 seasons. They finished in last place and 8th place 4 of those seasons, and in 6th place once. That was their highest finish.
Wow.
He was I think for me, very inspirational. I mean, talking to him was very inspirational. He was still incredibly modest about his accomplishments. he didn't mention anything about, or Roy Sievers did not talk about, oh, I should be known for this, I should be known for that. I think in many ways he was excited to talk about someone who knew about his career. I think baseball players, when you talk to baseball players who played, I mean, I was talking to him about his career 60 years earlier, of course. In many ways, they think who knows, you're maybe some young punk who doesn't know anything. Of course, when you start talking to a baseball player intelligently about his career, he also begins to open up and speaks about his career, about how much he loved playing in D.C. He loved the pageantry in baseball. He loved talking to the United States presidents who showed up during opening day.
Yeah. Let me interject here. Playing in Washington, certainly, it comes with its perks. And
right.
And Sievers, he certainly took advantage of it. He bragged about having lunch with Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and Eisenhower. Can you talk about what it was like playing baseball in the nation's capital back then and the kind of people you could find yourself with? I mean, I think he also somehow met Nikita Khrushchev.
Well, he did. He early on, after his first season, and especially after his record-breaking season in 1957, when he led the American League with 42 home runs and also led the league with 114 RBIs. I mean, he is a sought-after speaker in the off-season banquet circuit, and that's the case for several years for him. So he is. It's probably something that's difficult to understand now. I'm a member of several baseball historical associations, and in Milwaukee we have the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association. We have several banquets a year when former Milwaukee Braves come and speak to interested parties. But it might have been a time when baseball players did not earn a lot, and I'm not quite sure what Sievers' top salary was, but I think he told me it might have been in the mid 30s, which of course was a lot of money in the late 1950s.
Sure.
But in any case, throughout the 1950s, he augmented his income by being a popular speaker. Now, what does being a speaker mean? Well, he simply would have talked about what he did during the season. He would have, the same kind of today when we hear a baseball player speak, everyone's so excited during a fan fest. It was no different then, except the players weren't these millionaires like they are today, and there probably was a lot more accessibility to players. They were much more like you and me. And so he spoke with, he dined with presidents, he dined with ambassadors, he dined with diplomats. He went to all kinds of events in D.C. and was a very interesting man about town. As I mentioned, he wasn't. He had a high school formal education, but he was. Maybe you would call him today somewhat autodidactic, teaching himself about what's going on in the world, and seemed very interested. Also, with his wife taking her to these kinds of events. So he would seem to be very, from what I gathered speaking with him, he truly did love living in Washington, D.C. and being a part of the, let's say, the cultural landscape of Washington, D.C. Yeah, going to these kinds of dinners. Now, the team, as I said, was terrible. They drew, they had poor fan attendance, just like the St. Louis Browns did. Now, the Griffith family owned the Washington Senators, and Clark Griffith died. Calvin Griffith took over the team in 1956 and adjusted the fences in Griffith Stadium. That was one of the biggest stadiums in all of baseball. It was a mammoth stadium. You have to think of a mammoth ballpark, much like Forbes Field. He adjusted the dimensions a little bit beginning in 1956, and it also led to an increase in home runs. That's why you see these home run records set. His Sievers home run totals go from 29 to 42 and 39 in 1958. And in left field, where he hit a lot of his blasts, he was a typical pull hitter. Think of someone like Joe Adcock and these big sluggers of the 1950s. He was a pull hitter. In left field, they christened Sieversville, where he simply must have dumped a lot of home runs there. And so he was their star. He was their first star, Warren, in 20 years.
Wow.
He was their best player, really, their best hitter, the best home run hitter in their franchise history. He was their best player, really, since Goose Goslin in the 20s and Joe Cronin in the 1930s. But every year there were trade rumors that he would be going somewhere. I don't know if I wrote it in the biography, but Sievers told me that he would hear stories that he might be traded to Fenway Park, or might be traded to the Yankees, traded to the Red Sox or the Yankees. And he said, "My gosh, had I played in those places, I would have been hitting 50 home runs."
Wow. So let's talk about trades for a second here. Well, first of all, like we said, he ended up being one of the greats in the history of the Washington Senators. He had a good 58, a decent 1959, but then the Senators sent Roy to the White Sox. So how much did that have to do with the fact that Bill Veeck was now the owner of the White Sox? And by the way, he had just won the AL pennant. And did he want to reunite with Sievers?
Well, yes. I think two things. Well, number one, much like the Browns when Sievers played with him at the early part of the decade, Griffith is bleeding money. Fans are not turning out. Calvin Griffith needs cash inflow. By the end of the 1959 season, we have rising stars already with the Senators, and I think that the rising stars are Allison, Killebrew, Jim Lemon, so three really big home run sluggers. Killebrew led the American League in home runs in 1959, and Sievers was injured a little bit in 1959. He only played in 115 games, so he had been out about almost 1/3 of the season. So I think he was expendable. Not to mention, he was 32 years old, and so when it wasn't a surprise.
I wish I was only 32 years old.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Well, he was traded to the White Sox, and I think, as you mentioned, coming off the pennant, the Go-Go Sox, it was a fast team. Bill Veeck built that team on speed and on hitting. You think of people like Nellie Fox in 1959. I think he might have been the AL MVP in 59. That was his pitching strong team, great defense, led the American League in double plays. Louis Aparicio and Nellie Fox, middle infielders, Hall of Fame duo. And one of the complaints was they need some power. They need some power. So they bring him in, and in true Bill Veeck fashion, well, he mortgages the future.
Yeah, Earl Batty and Don Mincher, those are two decent ball players. When you look back at it, you got to think to yourself, the Senators really might have won that trade.
Well, they did. Of course, those players turned into all-stars for the Twins. Of course, the Senators leave after the 1960 season to become the Minnesota Twins, and 61 is expansion in the AL, so there's a new Washington Senators team, so they're not actually the same franchise.
Right.
But that's a different story for another one of your podcasts. He's traded to the White Sox. Looking back, I think Sievers was proud of this season as much of any season in baseball, in his baseball career. At the same time, was also a little bit frustrated. And he was frustrated because I think that he felt that Al Lopez, Hall of Fame manager, really did not know how to use him. And Lopez had a very convoluted platoon system, and he was platooning Sievers and Big Ted Kluszewski. Now, Big Clue, you think of him as such a great home run hitter with the Cincinnati Reds in the 1950s.
Big biceps, big biceps.
He was, of course, a football player at Purdue, too. So he's starts off with a very poor season. He doesn't get in his groove. He's not this platoon system. He's just not seeing action regularly enough. And he'd been a regular since 1954 after his injuries. He finally begins to play more regularly, and the White Sox, by the end of July, are in first place. And had the MVP vote taken place at the end of July, well, Roy Sievers probably would have been the MVP.
Wow.
That season. They trail. They cool off. The White Sox cool off in the last 2 months, and obviously don't win the pennant in 1960. The Yankees go back to their custom position in first place and take the pennant. But Roy Sievers has an incredible season. You could take modern counting statistics, 28 home runs and 93 RBIs, or you can take a look at maybe modern sabermetric statistics. He has an on-base percentage of almost 400. He slugs in around 530. His OBS was 930, and his OPS was 150. Those were some numbers I had written down because I wanted to mention those. Mm-hmm. Look at those modern statistics. Well, these are star statistics. I mean, his OPS plus 150, which was the second highest in his career. That's 50% above average of a major leaguer. This is really a wonderful season in Chicago in 1960. And he basically repeats those statistics in 1961.
But what happened? So what did he? So he has this great 60, a great 61. What happened to him? Was it the age? Did the shoulder start bothering him again? What happened?
Nope. He's traded at the end of the 1961 season. Don't forget, Veeck has to get rid of the team. It's the same old for Bill Veeck. Cash-strapped team. He's also undergoing some health problems, and that team eventually is sold to another Chicago majority ownership group. So Bill Veeck gets rid of the team. Here you have a 33, 34-year-old slugger who was one of the highest paid players on the team. They get rid of him, send him to Philadelphia.
Right. So he bounces around a little bit, and he's relegated to part-time duty. Plays for the Phillies, and then he heads back to Washington, only this time for the new Senators, who are now, by the way, the Texas Rangers. He ends up going to the new Senators, and I think he's just one of 9 guys to play for both Senator franchises. So,
he is, exactly.
So tell us about that period.
Oh, well, he does bounce around a little bit. He's with Philadelphia. He's a starter for 2 seasons. And has respectable numbers. I think it's important to note that in his first season for the Phillies in 1962, the Phillies win 81 games, 81 and 80 they go that season. They had improved they had won 47 games the previous season, and that 62 team, Gene Mauch, I believe, is the young manager in 1962, and the Phils have. Four players to hit 20 home runs for the first time in Phillies history. So that's an interesting factoid for those who like those kinds of factoids. In his second season with the Phillies, he hits 19 home runs, and that's ends his home run, his consecutive seasons of hitting 20 home runs, which he had done since 1954. So he had these seasons between 1954 and 1963. So these 10 seasons, the first 9 of which he hit 20 home runs. He is on the 64 team. The Phillies, of course, that's a
famous collapse.
The famous collapse, the fold, the PHOLD fold. Look like they're going to maybe capture the pennant. Sievers had already been traded early in the season, so he's not with that club during the fold. Maybe he could have offered some, veteran leadership and maybe some stability on the team. That's just conjecture. But he goes back to Washington and plays just a handful of games, pinch hitting duty, a little bit in the field. But at this time, I think Sievers recognizes that, he's 38 years old. He's at the end of his career. He difficulty running, difficulty even making contact, bats under 200. He realizes his career is nearing its end and retires. And I asked him, he hit a few milestones, of course, his last season in Philadelphia. It's his 300th home run off of Roger Craig to become the 18th player to hit 300 home runs. And I think that's a really important statistic. And he was proud of that. And I think it was an important milestone in baseball at that time. And I asked him, what did he anticipate doing after his baseball career? And that's a question that I've asked baseball players, and I've interviewed literally dozens and dozens of players, and I especially enjoy interviewing players from the 1950s. And I asked him, what did you think you would do? And I remember him telling me that he wasn't quite sure. He had played baseball his entire life. He didn't go to college. And he didn't know what he would do. And he went into managing in the minors. And he said, Greg, I could not feed my family.
Yeah, it didn't pay enough.
Yeah, I'm earning $10,000 or $12,000 a year. I have a family. We live in St. Louis. How do I simply raise my family and my kids? And he said, this was simply not a viable option for me to be a manager. And I think he might have managed for 4 years or so. If I recall correctly, he had also deliberated about maybe going into major league coaching, but there was no money in that either. And he thought there was simply not any kind of viable option to go into that. And he did go into business. I can't recall exactly. I think he went into some kind of freight business, like a trucking line out of St. Louis. And he worked there for about 20 years, let's say from around 1970 to around 1990.
Interesting. We talked about his perseverance. Obviously, he had a sweet stroke. He overcomes this career-threatening shoulder injury, which, by the way, I got to go back to one thing here. When he went from Baltimore to Washington, and he starts out in left field in Washington, he ultimately moves to first base. Why did Washington ultimately move him to first base? At what point did they say, if we really want to keep him in the lineup, we got to get him out of the outfield because he's hurting us there? And at what point did it just really suddenly start to click and he sort of, I guess, overcomes this shoulder injury and is able to start whacking the ball again? At what point, all of a sudden did it click? I mean, what happened there to overcome that injury?
Well, not so much. It's not as not so much injury related. As I mentioned, when he came up with when he was traded to the Senators to begin the 1954 season, Mickey Vernon was there. And Mickey Vernon was coming off a season that had led the American League in batting, and he still had several good seasons in him. So that position was down pat. And then Pete Runnels had played first base. And it wasn't really until 1959 that Sievers was moved to first base. And the main reason was because of another big slugger, and that was Jim Lemon, with a big roundhouse swing, a really strong slugger.
Mm-hmm.
He was such a poor fielder at first and third base, they had to move him into left field so they could simply kind of hide him out there. So it was more so, there's someone who is a really bad fielder. We need to get him out to left field.
So Sievers' first years, his first 5 years in Washington, he was really playing left field and didn't move to first base until 59. Right. Oh,
exactly.
I didn't understand that.
Right,
okay.
right. Yeah, because Mickey Vernon is there for the first few years, and Pete Reynolds, and his move to first base is simply precipitated by Jim Lemon. And Jim Lemon was, we're talking about, he was a mammoth home run hitter. Like Killebrew and Sievers and Bob Allison, they were all big home run hitters in 1959. But you had mentioned his swing, Roy Sievers' swing, and I need to really mention that because it, for me, is one of the things when I think about perseverance and how baseball players can be, they can be inspirational. Roy Sievers told me that he developed his swing by watching one of his favorite players, and that was Joe Ducky Medwick of the St. Louis Cardinals. Perfect balance, perfect position, perfect follow through, elbow up, chin tucked in, perfect follow through. And you have a shoulder injury that adjusts your swing. Now, I live in Chicago, as you know, and the big discussion we've had over the last year and a half is the shoulder injury that Chris Bryant had caused him to have 3 different swings last year. And of course, his numbers were way down from his MVP season 2 years earlier. And even right now, we can see that he's beginning to come out of it, but he had been struggling for the first 25 games or so. So Roy Sievers went through these 4 seasons where it looked like his career could be over. And he redeveloped and worked on that swing to get it back to where it was when he was Rookie of the Year in 1949. And that was so graceful and so smooth. This was textbook beautiful swing. And I think it's so good that it was Hollywood-like. And maybe it was more than just Hollywood-like. It was Hollywood.
Wow.
And he was the swinging double for Tab Hunter in the movie Damn Yankees. So if you watch the Hollywood film Damn Yankees from the 1950s and watch Tab Hunter, who plays Joe Hardy, swing, it is Roy Sievers who actually is swinging the bat. We're talking about this is Holly. He had a Hollywood swing.
Sweet stroke. You know, you also mentioned one other thing at the start of our show today. In the article you wrote about Roy Sievers for Sabre, in the first paragraph, you mentioned one of the most impressive facts about Roy, and that was his ability to pull through in the clutch. Almost a quarter of his 318 home runs were hit in the 8th inning or later. He connected for 9 walk-off blasts, 10 grand slams, and 10 pinch hit home runs. Talk about his ability to pull through in the clutch, because that is some real clutch hitting.
Yeah, I mean, I read, you gave the statistics. I don't know what more I could say about that other than it is a remarkable number of home runs that were hit in the 8th inning or later. The number of grand slams, the pinch hit home runs. I mean, this is a home run slugger who also pinch hits. Now, I've not done it, but it would be interesting for a listener to get on baseballreference.com and find out among those home run hitters with 300 or more, how many of those have at least 10 pinch hit home runs. I just can't imagine many.
I'd like to know how many, period.
Right. I would say what makes the statistic for me really amazing is he played for such terrible teams during his great seasons in Washington. All 6 seasons were terrible. He played for terrible teams. Yet, pitchers still threw them. And I wonder, how is that possible?
Yeah.
they could have simply walked them.
We look back and, yeah, he played for some terrible teams. And unfortunately, there's some players, great players in the history of all sports who played on terrible teams, were great players and never made it into the postseason. Ernie Banks.
Right.
I'm watching the NHL playoffs right now, and there's a guy on the St. Louis Blues, Jay Bouwmeester, who's been around for 10 years, and this is a league that has 16 teams make the playoffs, and this is his first time making the playoffs. So it happens. I'd like to end our show today with this. Roy Sievers was one of the first two players in history, if I follow this correctly, to hit at least 300 home runs and not be enshrined in Cooperstown. Gil Hodges was the other. Why was Roy passed over? Heck, for that matter, why was Hodges passed over? Why the two of them? I just, especially Hodges. I mean, I'm a Mets fan. My dad grew up a Dodgers fan, and I mean that one is just mind-boggling.
But for me, that one makes no sense at all. Playing with all those great teams in Brooklyn in the 1950s and the 1969 Miracle Mets, and his early death. I find that to be a travesty. I'd like to see baseball, the Veterans Committee, get Hodges in.
Yeah.
But with Sievers, you're right. He's one of two of that generation, of those who hit 300 home runs. The first two that did not make it to the Hall of Fame. I really go back to maybe a motif that I mentioned early on. He played and had his best seasons for teams that had absolutely terrible records. They were poor hitting teams, they were poor pitching teams, and they were eighth. They were cellar dwelling teams, last place, second to last place teams. And he simply had really no national name recognition.
Wow.
Unlike Hodges, of course, who's going to, back then, of course, winning the pennant and going to the World Series, no playoffs, but he's getting national attention. And you have to imagine, in an era without, obviously, the instant gratification of looking up information about scores in real time or even the next day, people are not, where would you hear about Roy Sievers?
Yeah.
If you live in Washington, and that was a team that was also just attracting 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 fans at games.
And he played for the second team in St. Louis.
Right. And he played for the second team. So he was 33 years old by the time that he got to the White Sox in Chicago. That was the first team that he played on that had a winning record. And of course, by that time, there are bigger names in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
He's playing on a team with a reigning AL MVP. You have little Nellie Fox playing, and Louis Aparicio. Maybe if he had the White Sox won another pennant, maybe had he won an MVP or more recognition, but his tenure there was short, and the same as in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. They had, 2 seasons, but they didn't make it to the pennant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I would never go so far as to say that Roy Sievers should be in the Hall of Fame, but I would say that he is someone who is simply forgotten. And if you're like me and those who want to understand which players were considered the great players in the era during which they played, well, people looked at Roy Sievers as one of the best players.
And that's why we do this podcast, because like you said, he's forgotten, and we bring these great players whom time has forgotten, or for whatever reason, they're just not remembered, and we bring their stories back to life. And Roy Sievers is just a perfect example of why I do this podcast.
I always say, you got to download these podcasts and listen to them on your way to work. Download every one of them, no matter what sport, to learn a little bit about players, whether they be baseball, your football, basketball, and your hockey players. in a historical context. Nobody knows Roy Sievers today, yet at one time he was considered among the most feared sluggers in baseball, not just for 1 or 2 years, but we're talking about for almost a decade.
Yep, exactly. Greg, I want to thank you so much for joining me again on Sports Forgotten Heroes. What are you working on right now?
Well, big news coming out of Sabre. I have a new book that is officially online, purchasable now already from Amazon, and that is a book on Wrigley Field.
Awesome.
It is a wonderful Sabre publication, over 400 pages, 100 essays about the history of Wrigley Field through historical and monumental and groundbreaking games at Wrigley Field, from the first games played there during the Federal League through the most recent games last year. That book has just been launched. It's already available, as I said, on Amazon.com and on at Sabre site as well. And if all goes well, Warren, I think my next book, which is on Comiskey Park, might be out near the end of the summer, maybe during September, maybe during the mad rush of the pennant chase in September. The book will be out.
Very
so I have a big
cool.
summer plan.
Very cool. Congratulations on both, Greg. Awesome.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you again for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Well, I really appreciate it, and it's a wonderful thing that you're doing. And I think this is one of the reasons that I enjoy volunteering so much with Sabre, is because of how we're dedicated to preserving history and telling the story. And I think with Roy Sievers, maybe one could write a biography without interviewing players, but I think my goal was to give Roy Sievers his voice in telling his story, and I'm so happy that I did at that time, because he passed not long thereafter.
You did. Again, thanks so much for joining me.
I appreciate it, Warren. You take care.
You too.
Thank you.
Every sport is littered with terrific stars whom time has forgotten. And as Greg and I just talked about, Roy Sievers certainly falls into that category. His career spanned 17 seasons. He was the Rookie of the Year in 1949. Then injuries slowed him down, and when you combine 1950, 51, 52, and 53, he hit just 19 home runs and played in only 247 games, an average of just 61 games a year. Over the next 10 years, Sievers hit 275 home runs. That's 27 and a half homers a year. Overall, he hit .318. Certainly a solid career. And one has to wonder, what would have happened if he didn't lose the 4 years to injury after winning Rookie of the Year? Still, Roy Sievers enjoyed a terrific baseball career. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to go way back in time to talk about the only guy in baseball history to play the game, manage a major league team, and work the game as an umpire. And it's his work as an umpire in one particular game that contributed to his legacy as one of the most important figures in baseball and World Series history. We will talk about the very unique career of Hank O'Day. That's next time. For now, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of FilmMusic.io.